History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. So wrote James Joyce in his semi-autobiographical novel, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Many in Ireland would understand what he was trying to say, because Irish history for many has been a nightmare which has cast a long shadow over the centuries. It has been a history of colonization and conquest, a history where the religion of the majority was suppressed and oppressed over the centuries, a history where over the years Irish would rise up in rebellion after rebellion, only to see those rebellions crushed. And yet, despite all of those tragedies, there was an enduring optimism, a spirit that the Irish would overcome. And it was perhaps reflecting on this in verse that G.K. Chesterton wrote the lines, "For the great Gaels of Ireland are the men that God made mad, for all their wars are merry, and all their songs are sad." In fact, you have to go a long way back to see a successful Irish war. In fact, some would say that the greatest victory in Irish history on the field of battle occurred in the year 1014, when King Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, united the Irish people against the Viking oppressors, and so on Good Friday met them at Clontarf on the outskirts of Dublin and won a decisive victory. It is said that Brian was 88 years old on the day of this great victory, and after winning one of the best victories in Irish history, he retired to his tent for prayer, for it was Good Friday. And there, on his knees, a fleeing Viking invader ran into his tent and chopped him down, killed him dead. And so Brian, slain in his tent, became one of the great images of Irish history. What followed that was centuries of defeat. The story of an Irish people not only in decline, but oppressed. And that was also something that Stephen Gwynne reflected on at the start of the 20th century. Gwynne was a poet, a novelist, a writer, and his brother Edward would later become the provost or president of Trinity College Dublin. And he wanted to reflect on, I suppose, this legacy of defeats over the centuries. The song or poem is called A Song of Defeat, and it begins, "Not for the lucky warriors, the winner at Waterloo, or him of a newer name, whom loud-voiced triumph acclaim, victor against the few. Not for these, O era, I build in my heart today the lay of your sons and you, and the Danes in headlong slaughter sent, and the women of Era keening, for Brian slain at his tent. Era loved Brian well, for Brian fought and he fell, but Brian fought and he won. God, that was long ago." And what he was getting at was that ever since that great victory, it seemed that Ireland had been starved of victories. And in the period of this course, we will look at a number of those defeats. We have the 1798 rebellion, when the Irish rose up inspired by the American and French revolutionary examples. But that was crushed and 30,000 people lost their lives. 5 years later, a young idealistic hero, Robert Emmet, led a rebellion on the streets of Dublin. But it was a pathetic failure. Emmet was captured and put on trial, and there he rescued the rebellion from its failure by delivering a speech from the dock that would inspire future generations, a speech that was considered one of the greatest courtroom orations in history. There followed more defeats, more rebellions, one in 1848, in the middle of the Great Irish Famine, a catastrophe which saw 1 million Irish people die and another 1 million people forced to emigrate. The Irish rose up again in 1867 in the Fenian Uprising, but that too was crushed. And so there were a period of years where nothing happened, where Ireland seemed content and in a lull. But yet, that was what Stephen Gwynn was getting at, harking back to the memory of Brian Boru and that great victory. God, that was long ago. And he set out a litany of some of those heroes. I call to your minds Lord Edward Fitzgerald of 1798, Tone with his mangled throat, Wolfe Tone, the leader of the United Irishmen in that rebellion, Emmet high on the gallows, Robert Emmet, who would go to the death bravely in 1803, O'Brien, Mitchell and Marr, three of the Young Ireland leaders of 1848. And of newer note, names that era will not forget, though some have faded in far-off lands, and some have passed by the hangman's hands, and some are breathing yet. Ever defeated, yet undefeated, of thy remembering race. For their names are treasured apart, and their memories green and sweet, on every hillside and every marsh, in every cabin, in every street, of a land where to fail is more than to triumph, and victory less than defeat. And those last two lines in particular seem to resonate with the course of Irish history. A land where to fail was to more than to triumph, where victory was less than a defeat. Because throughout this period, it seemed to be the accumulation of one defeat after the other. You had the colonization of Ireland, the conquest, where Ireland had its land taken from her by the plantations of the 17th century. The Irish rose up in rebellion in 1641, the first of 6 rebellions referenced in the 1916 proclamation. That was defeated, and it also created a bitter legacy for those Irish Protestants who felt that the Irish Catholics could never be trusted, and the spectre of 1641 was to haunt them for centuries. In 1690, the Catholic King of England, James II, came to Ireland, where his army was defeated by the Protestant usurper William of Orange, who took the throne of England to defend those Protestant values. And so 1690 became the second great defeat. And after that, the British government introduced a series of restrictions, a series of laws that proved to be the most oppressive laws that Ireland had ever encountered. They were known simply as the penal laws. And they were aimed not to convert the Catholics, because if everyone was a Protestant, then how would you distinguish yourself? No, they were aimed at keeping the Catholics down, at oppressing them, at humiliating them. It was a way of getting revenge for 1641 and for everything else. And so in the 18th century, Ireland was a land divided, where 8/10 of the population were Catholic, but had no political or civil rights. They were an outcast people in their own land, a dispossessed, defeated people. And various champions emerged in that century to press for Irish rights. The great writer Jonathan Swift. In the British Imperial Parliament, you had Edmund Burke. In Ireland at the end of the 18th century, you had Henry Grattan, a man who tried to restore the rights of the Irish Parliament and fight for the dispossessed Irish Catholics. But influenced by the American and French revolutions, there was also a different group of people who believed that Ireland should rise up and through the use of force establish its own independent republic. And the leader of that was Theobald Wolfe Tone. And following the failure of his rebellion in 1798, and afterwards when he committed suicide in prison, the government decided to abolish the Irish Parliament and rule directly from London. And that Act of Union in 1800 was to create the inspiration for so many other future rebellions, because so much else became about restoring that Parliament, restoring that sense of Irish political pride. Robert Emmet rose up in rebellion in 1803 and was defeated. Afterwards, they rose up a great Catholic champion, a man from the people, a man from Kerry called Daniel O'Connell, who became a lawyer, an orator, a statesman, an inspiration to millions not just in Ireland but around the world, by leading the world's first mass peaceful movement to win full rights for Catholics. It took him almost 30 years to do so, and he did it without resorting to violence. Afterwards, he tried to work to restore the Irish Parliament, taking on the might of the British Empire. But his refusal to countenance the use of violence ended up being his undoing, and he failed in his second great objective. He died in 1847 in the midst of the Great Irish Famine, the greatest catastrophe in Irish history. And there followed up more weak rebellions. There followed up more constitutional agitation led by Charles Stewart Parnell, Isaac Butt and others, until in the 20th century, Ireland was at a crossroads. Would it try to continue to fight this struggle for independence through peaceful means, in Parliament, or would it try to return to violent means? And 1914 was the pivotal year when it looked like Ireland might have its Parliament restored by constitutional means, but the outbreak of the First World War changed everything. And so, in the middle of that great European and global catastrophe, the Irish rose up in rebellion in 1916. It too was a dramatic failure. The leaders were taken out and shot. But their death unleashed something new in Ireland. It inspired the Irish people. For the first time in a long time, people believed that Ireland could be free. And it set in train a series of events that culminated in the winning of Irish independence in 1921. The events of 1916 then don't really mark the culmination of this course. In a way, 1916 represented the event that led to the birth of the Irish state. But the Irish nation had been created long before that. It was created by men like Theobald Wolfe in the 18th century, by Robert Emmet at the start of the 19th, by Daniel O'Connell, who raised the Irish Catholics from their knees and led them on brilliant crusades for civil and political rights, by Charles Stewart Parnell, who faced down successive British governments from the floor of the House of Commons. And then in 1916, finally there was an example, a demonstration of physical force that bonded the country together, even though they had opposed it at the start. And this was reflected upon by W.B. Yeats in a brilliant poem called Easter 1916, where he reflected on the course of Irish history, this period when Ireland had been in rebellion, and how out of all of this, the course of Irish history had been changed. Something new had emerged, and out of that phoenix from 1916 would come a free Irish people, a free, independent Irish state. I'll read the final verse. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them until they died? I write it out in verse, MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.